Hi there. Welcome back to another Tuesday's Tips. I'm Greg Kaiser, and this week we're going to look at a very simple tip and something that's often overlooked, I think, in the editing process, or it's done for the wrong reasons. And it's along the lines of contrast within a photo, and contrast is one of the biggest things that we can do in post-processing. The part we're going to look at today, though, is essentially setting a white and a black point in your photo. And this is very easy to do in any image editor. We're going to look at Lightroom. The principles are the same in Photoshop, Capture One, anything along those lines. It's done a little bit differently, and there's different ways of doing it. We're going to look at the most simple way today in Lightroom. We'll get into a more complicated way later on when we look at tone curves. But for now, I want to just look at simply setting a white and a black point in the photograph. And to give you an idea of why this is important, we are essentially setting the dynamic range in a photograph, because if you think about a histogram and you've got the darks over here on this side of the histogram and the brights over here on this side of the histogram, if you take a photo and the histogram actually begins and ends somewhere like this, looking at the edges of the screen, you're missing out on a lot of gradation within that photo. So the idea of setting that white and black point is to stretch those edges out of the histogram to where they touch on both sides but don't clip, except in some different situations we'll get into. But it widens that range of tones that you've got inside of the image that you're editing, which makes it easier to edit, and it gives you more ability to add contrast in certain areas. So we're going to go ahead and get into it, and we're going to take a look at how things are going. So we've switched over, and hopefully you can see my Lightroom screen at this point. I've picked a few photos here that I've recently edited to talk about, and the first one is going to be more or less a standard type situation. And this is the raw capture straight out of camera. It's been assigned the Adobe Color Profile, which is the default. We've talked about that before. But the end result of this photograph was this. That was after the edit. Now, if you look at the histogram, this is what I ended up with, and you see how the tones are completely stretched across. We go to the original, and you see how the tones are completely different. They're still stretched across, but you've got these main humps here, right here at the midtones, and then a lot in the highlights. I wanted to get those spread out a little bit more, get more gradual gradation through the image, and what we're talking about today is part of that step. So we're not going to go through a complete edit, as we don't usually do here, although I do plan on at some point going through the whole process of an edit on a photo when I can do it in about 15-20 minutes or so. But that's for another time. What we're looking at in the basic panel here, you've got these three basic areas, which is the white balance. You've got the tone, which is exposure, contrast, highlight, shadows, whites and blacks. This is what we're talking about today, whites and blacks. Presence is the other thing. We'll talk about this later. Texture, clarity, dehaze, vibrance, and saturation. But what we're looking at is the white point and the black point, and these correspond to the histogram. And if you look up here at the top, the white point is going to be all the way stretched over here to the right, the black point all the way stretched over here to the left. These little arrows up here are warnings for clipping. So when you get to a point, and just if we dropped the exposure and say we underexposed this picture really badly in the field, that arrow is going to illuminate, showing that it's been clipped, so it's too dark. Same thing goes on the highlight. If we push it overexposed, that arrow is going to go. So fortunately, I knew what I was doing in the field. It happens occasionally. I know it surprises me as well, but I got the exposure pretty much right. Everything is where I needed it to be. Highlights are protected. The darks are right here at the bottom, but I can stretch that even more. And part of that is going to be dealing with the white point and black point. Now I can take this slider and I can move it to the right and look at the picture, and I can see that it is starting to brighten. And if we take it all the way, you see what goes on here. We're taking that right half of the histogram and we're kind of stretching it out. But up here at plus 49, I'm still not showing any clipping up here on that arrow. Looking at the histogram, I'm right here at the edge, so that looks like it would be okay. But I'm here to tell you there's a better way of doing this, because anything that is clipped is going to appear as just blank white on the paper. So we're going to zero that back out by double clicking, and on a PC you hold the Alt button down, and on a Mac I believe it's the Option button, one of those keys, Option or Command, but I think it's Option. If you hold that down and left click on that slider, you make the picture disappear. It's deleted, it's gone. No, it's not. No, what this has done is it's showing you what pixels are clipped. And as you drag this slider to the right, look, you've now got a couple of pixels right there in kind of the center right half of the screen. It's just a couple of pixels there, but that's at plus 11. And you'll notice that that clipping is happening right here on the railing. And what that is telling me is I have now stretched that dynamic range as far as I can, and I'm actually starting to clip some pixels in the highlight range. So the idea is once you get to that point, you back it off just enough to where that pixel is gone. So we're now at plus 5. There are no colored pixels on the screen, which means we're right at the edge of that capture, which is where I want to be. I've stretched that histogram as far to the right as I can go without losing detail. Now the same thing goes with black. And as you see here, there's a lot of stuff that looks black in this scene, but there's nothing that's absolutely black just yet. So what we're going to do, we're going to do the same thing. We can either take this slider and we can drop it down, and you see what it's doing to the picture, and you're kind of adding that depth to the picture, and you can do it by sight, no problem there. I'm at negative 72, but I have a feeling that all of this is probably way too dark. And looking up here at this arrow, I have clipped, and if I click that arrow, all of this that's in blue is clipped. There is no detail in these shadows. That's not what I want. I can go to the point where that arrow, if you look up at the histogram, just starts to hit and come back. There we go. At negative 7. I click that, and there's just a little bit of black right here. Deep, deep shadows. A little bit here, a little bit here. That may be okay. But for me, I like to see some actual true blacks in my photographs. Things that have real shadow, I want to actually see that bunched up black. That's just how I like to edit my pictures. Again, everything in editing is suit to taste. So we're going to do the same thing with the black slider. We're going to hold that Alt key or the Option on a Mac, left click, and you see the screen goes white. And from where we were at 0, there's just that little bit that's clipping. That for me is not enough. So I will generally come to about right here, which is now negative 12. And you see what is clipping, and you see some colors, and that's where the different color channels are clipping. Those things that are the pixels that are actually total black, that is where all 3 color channels are clipping, and that is a complete black pixel at that point. So that is where I would start my edit. And I've added 5 on the whites, I've dropped the blacks to negative 12, and what that's done is it's spread that range of tones throughout on the histogram. So that gives me a good place to start working, and that's one of the first things that I'll do. I'll always work the highlight, shadows, whites, and blacks to get started with an image. and then I'll do everything else. And the idea is I'll end up getting an image like this. And if you look up at the histogram, everything's been spread out. There's nothing clipping on the highlights because I don't like clipping the highlights and losing details, with an exception that we will get into. On the blacks, you see that those areas in blue underneath the pier, those are the areas that are black. They're deep in shadow. I am perfectly okay with losing detail there. The human eye is used to seeing no detail in the shadows that are that deep, so I'm fine with that. It's clipping on the highlights that I'm worried about. When I get done or about done with my edit, I'll go back and reevaluate the white and black point, because I'll do things locally that may change that relationship, and I do want to keep everything as spread out as possible. I ended up dropping my whites a little bit more to +4. Blacks, I raised them from -12, I believe, to -4, because I added a lot of shadow through here, darkened the water, so that increased that black point. So I had to compensate for that later. So I start with the white and black point, and I finish with the white and black point. Same thing applies. You hold the Alt or Option key, you left click, and you can see what's clipped there. Same thing with the highlights. There is nothing, not a single pixel clipped in the highlights. So that is one way of looking at this. Now there's another situation, and we're going to go to this, where it is a low contrast scene. And you can see here, this is again the raw capture. And it's a low contrast scene. You can tell by the histogram that there's really nothing in the absolute blacks. There's nothing in the shadow areas. There's nothing in the extreme highlights. Everything is in the mids and the brights. So I don't want to lose that. So what we end up with is we end up with an image that is still low contrast, but you see how the histogram now is spread out. I've still got an emphasis on the brighter areas. And a lot has to do with how I handle the white and the black point. Now there's a lot more spread here, but as you add that spread, you are adding contrast. So again, we're going to go with how I would start this, and we're going to set a white and black point. Now, if we went with how I would normally do it, as we went into on the last one, I'm going to do that option, or the Alt Option key, and I'm going to drag up until I start to see the clipping, and back up until there's nothing clipping, at +68 on the white, and same thing, come down on the black until we get just some clipping, and that would be about it on a normal scene. I've got some absolute black and some kind of gradations in black. All of a sudden we have a much higher contrast scene. That's not what we want. But now we know what the limits are. I can go +68 on the white, and I can go -81 on black. But the idea here is I don't want that much contrast. So I'm going to do this visually, knowing that I'm not going to clip anything on either direction. And I'm just going to drag things until it looks good, knowing what my boundaries are. That is about as much contrast as I would want to bring in from the white and black point. Nothing is clipping. You can see up here on the histogram, nothing is even remotely close on either side. These are the values that I've set to begin with. And again, I'm going to go through and edit and change things around, and I'll come back and reevaluate. But this kind of sets up the beginning of the edit, and it's done by vision with a lower contrast scene, because I don't want to take those values to the extremes in either direction. And looking at it from standpoint of the actual picture, is there anything in here that would be total white? Sure, the waves have white in them, but they're not total white. They aren't that bright. There's not direct sunlight on them. So they're going to be in an area of bright, but not an extreme white. Same thing with the shadows. Even though we've got, dark areas under the pier, there is nothing that's going to be exactly black. It's a very low contrast scene, there's fog, there's mood, there's ambience, all of that I want to keep in this photo. So to do that, I can't have the amount of contrast that I would in a normal, well-lit scenario. And the idea is to keep that same mood in place. And what I ended up with was I boosted the whites by 23 in the end, just to give a little bit of separation to these areas, brighten that. And it's not just dealing with the white tones, it's dealing with everything from, around here on the histogram up, stretches that all out. With the blacks, there was some local adjustments here that I closed the image in down here at the bottom. But again, I didn't want the shadows here to go completely black. So it's a season to taste. There's not a right way or a wrong way to do this. There's just several different ways of dealing with it. So we've talked about 2 color images. So what about when we deal with a black and white image? Now, of course, I'm not shooting on a black and white only camera, so even when I plan on doing a black and white image, it comes in as a color raw. So that was a situation with this. It came in as a color image, and what I end up doing, and we've talked about this before, is I would switch it over to a black and white, and let's just say black and white 1 is what we're going to go with for this one. So that gets us the color profile that we're looking at, and now we can set that white and black point. Now, a good black and white, and again, there are examples where this isn't the case, but there are a lot of good arguments for a black and white photograph having a pure black and a pure white point. So that way you get the entire range of gray tones. Again, there are exceptions to that rule, but generally that's what we want. So if we go to the white, and again, look at the histogram up at the top, and you can see if I'm dialing in plus 32, it shows plus 32 under the histogram, and it keeps climbing until I get to that point where there is some clipping. We can click that and we can see, okay, those areas in red, that is what's clipping in this picture. We can deal with that. Again, I like to go and do the Alt or Option on a Mac and pull it up and see where the pixels are. And for a black and white, I'll actually keep some of these blown out pixels, but not many of them. And if you'll notice, there's a good many pixels here that are clipping at plus 46, but on the histogram, it's not showing that close. But I do have an absolute white point in that black and white. Same thing goes with black. I can pull this down, looking up at the histogram, I've got a long way to go. And right there is where it starts to clip. And if we go up and hover, you can see the blue underneath the pier, or underneath the boardwalk. That's what's clipping. That's not a lot, and this is a very bright image, so I do want some good solid black tones. So I'll unclick that, and we're going to come back to the blacks and double click, make that 0, hold the Alt or Option key, and drag to the left. Now we can see where those pixels are coming in. And I would say somewhere around in there is where I want. I want a good deep black point. That's now negative 54. It was negative 40 something, so we've added some more there. That gives a lot of the body to this picture. So now I've got a good starting point where the histogram is spread out, and I can work these tones. And I can adjust things locally, like the sky, which is obviously brighter than I would want it. And the end result is something like this. Again, we went from a histogram that was fairly concentrated and had a lot of room here on the left and a lot of room here on the right. We've spread it out from the black side to the white side, and we've got all these great gray tones in the middle. But I do have a true black point. If I click that, you see where all this blue is. Those are the true black pixels in this image, and those are very important for the depth. And this is all deep shadow. You don't expect to see shadow, or don't expect to see detail there. We come over and clip the highlights. I don't know if you can see this on the video, but there's just a couple little pixels here. I do have a white point. I've got plenty of bright points, but I do have a white point. So for a black and white photograph, I've got a spread of tones from absolute black to absolute white, and I've got all of these great gradations of gray in between. So that's what I aim for with a black and white edit, and it comes down to contrast. We're going to look at one more example, and we're going to call it a day from there. But this is one of those situations, and I said there were examples where I'm okay with the highlights clipping. It's rare, because if you print this out, it's just the paper color. That's all that you see. And generally speaking, that's not what you really want to happen. The exception is when you are looking at specular highlights that when you look at it with your own eyes in person, you're used to those clipping. Here's a great example. What's left of the chrome of this 46 here has some reflective qualities, and it is reflecting the bright sky. You know, all these areas here, even in the headlights, those are areas that I would expect to see so bright that my eyes couldn't resolve it. I shot the image with that in mind and actually exposed it so that I ended up clipping in camera just a little bit on those areas. It's not much. Shooting in RAW, that's actually recoverable. But I did not mind having the quote-unquote blinkies on the back of my camera image review showing that there was clipping. That didn't bother me because I knew my edit was going to have clipping in these areas anyway. So we go back to the raw image, but this is how it ends up. And you see I've got all the black there, deep shadows, and I've got the same clipping. It's controlled a little bit better, but that's what I end up with. And from the raw image, I kind of got ahead of myself, but from the raw image, we would go through, we would select color profile. For this one, I believe I used landscape because it worked really well for the purple tones and the green tones. And again, you just find a good starting point. That adds a little bit of contrast anyway, so if we come up here, we've still got clipping, but it adds a little bit of shadow detail that I liked. So we come down and do the same thing with the whites. Now, looking at the histogram, we already know there's clipping in the whites. We already know that the histogram's all the way over to the right, but let's do the Alt or Option and left click, and let's see where those are. Now, that may be a little much for me. So for this, we're going to pull the highlights down just a smidge. There we go. And we're going to go back to the whites. And you see, that's taking care of a lot of the whites, but now I do want to bring some of that clipping back. And we're going to go to about right there. Plus 14, and you see I've got a good many pixels that are clipping, but I've brought down the brights and the highlights by this highlight slider and then brought just the whites back up. So this area right in here in the histogram, I shifted back towards midtone. That's the highlights. And then the extreme highlights and the brights, I brought those back out to the edge. And with the blacks, let's see, there is nothing showing to be clipping on the histogram. So I exposed to the right. I took it as far right as I could so that I had plenty of detail to work with. Now I come over here to the black point, it goes to that white screen with the Alt or Option key pressed, so I have nothing clipping at all. So I start dragging to the left, and there's that inner fender, and I know there's not going to be any detail there. So I'm going to go ahead and go until I see some total black, and there's a little bit there at -14. The blue and the magenta pixels, that's showing the color channels that are starting to clip, but there's still some information there. When the pixels go completely black, that's when I've clipped all 3 of the color channels. And that's where that ends up. So if I were to take the highlights and shadows, blacks and whites, out of this equation, I go up here and hit the eyeball next to basic. That brings us back to where we started without those adjustments. And you see how I've managed to add contrast, but in a careful, considered way. If you pay attention, especially, look over here at the grill and the lights and where those highlights had been occurring. Just keep looking there. And this is how we ended up with just those 3 sliders. This is without those 3 sliders. With the adjustments, without the adjustments. So from the raw capture, I overexposed on purpose to clip some of the areas on the chrome because I knew that's how I would edit it. I could recover it in post because the camera's got that ability. And with just those little bit of adjustments, I've now brought in detail to the headlights. Although there is still absolute white, I've brought in detail to the chrome, though there is still absolute white. So that's an example of when it's okay to clip the highlights if it's something that you're naturally going to see clipped. So I hope that this has helped give you an idea of some of the possibilities that you can have by setting a white and a black point. And like I mentioned, I'll do this at the beginning of an edit so that I have all the tones available to me to work with, and then at the end of the edit I will go in and figure out exactly where I need to fine-tune those, because doing local adjustments, dodging and burning will affect the white and black point. And if you have those arrows highlighted through the entire process, you can see if you are clipping on either direction. Most of the time, though, that's distracting for me, so I don't highlight those until the very end, and I'm just fine-tuning that white and black point. So contrast is always going to be very important. Just keep in mind, not every image has a lot of contrast. Some images, like foggy scenes, like that pier shot, are going to be better when there is lower contrast and you actually have empty space on the left side of the histogram and the right side of the histogram. There's other times when you want a higher contrast scene and you actually want a little bit of clipping on both. For the most part, and for most average photographs, you want to have clipping on the shadow end, not a lot, but suit that to taste just to give the picture a little bit of body. And you want to go right up to the clipping point on the highlights, but not beyond it, because anything that clips in highlights is going to print as paper color, and that may not be what you're after. In the situation of chrome, in the situation of sunlight glinting off of water, those are specular highlights, and those we expect to see without detail. So there's not a problem at all by clipping those particular channels. So that pretty much brings us to the end of the white and black points. If there's anything in Lightroom that you are interested in learning more about, drop a comment, let me know. I'm always happy to look at suggestions for these quick Tuesdays tips. If you are looking to increase your knowledge of Lightroom and post-processing or photography in general, I do offer mentorships, and there'll be links to all this in the description. So I would invite you to consider that, and I would love to talk with you further about your needs and expectations and see if I would be a good fit. Outside of that, I hope everybody has a great week, and I'll see you again next Tuesday with another Tuesday's Tips.